Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. When people today recall Martin Luther King, they most often mention a single speech, his famous address about a dream. Yet behind that speech stood an entire life, the path of a pastor who became the leader of millions, a man who continued forward knowing the cost of every step. In this video, you will learn how exactly his movement began, why the struggle for a seat on a bus in Montgomery became the beginning of a new story for the entire country, what lay behind the loud marches and rallies, what King spoke about in prisons and in the solitude of his own thoughts, and what happened during the final months of his life. The Poor People's Campaign, the strike in Memphis, and that very last speech delivered on the eve of tragedy. We will examine not only the facts, but also what remained after him. Why today, decades later, his words resound once again. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. In Atlanta, the capital of the state of Georgia, a city where the summer air carried the fragrance of magnolias and the spring streets awakened to the singing of birds, on January 15th of the year 1929, a boy named Michael King Jr. was born, a boy who would one day become one of the most renowned champions of civil rights in American history. His name was later changed to Martin Luther King Jr., reflecting not only a tribute to the reformer of the 16th century, but also a symbolic readiness to walk the path of transformation. His family lived in the Sweet Auburn district, which at that time was considered the center of African American culture and public life in Atlanta. Here stood shops, churches, schools, newspaper offices, and community organizations, all united by a single shared characteristic. They belonged to people who, despite unjust laws, strove to preserve dignity and the right to their own lives. Martin's father, Michael King Sr., was a Baptist pastor of Ebenezer Church, a respected man known not only for his preaching gift, but also for his active position in defending the rights of black residents of the city. In the year 1934, returning from a trip to Europe, during which he had visited Germany, he changed his own name in honor of the reformer Martin Luther and began calling his son by the same name. Though official documents with the name Michael King remained, in everyday life the boy was thereafter known differently. Martin's mother, Alberta Williams King, came from a family of church leaders. She played the organ in the church, taught music, and raised the children. Alongside Martin grew his older sister Christine and his younger brother, Alfred Daniel. The King home stood on Auburn Avenue, and life within it flowed with constant movement. Neighbors, relatives, and church parishioners gathered there, discussed news, read the Bible, and sang hymns. For the children, schoolwork and participation in church services were both obligatory parts of life, and Martin often listened to his father's sermons, filled with ideas of justice, equality, and faith in a better future. Yet even at a very young age, Martin encountered the realities of the system that shaped the lives of millions of African Americans in the South. At the age of 6, he lived through an incident he would remember for the rest of his life. He had 2 white friends who lived nearby, and the 3 boys played together almost daily. They raced, flew paper kites, and spent hours outdoors. One day, however, the parents of the white boys announced that their children were no longer allowed to play with Martin because he was a black boy, and such interaction was inappropriate. It was a sudden blow. Martin came home in tears and asked his parents why this had happened. His mother and father explained to him that the Jim Crow laws in their state forbade black and white people from interacting as equals, separating schools, buses, parks, and restaurants, and that this system was unjust. Yet it was the reality they had to live within. From that moment onward, a sense of the injustice surrounding him grew within Martin. But alongside it grew another quality, a desire to understand and to learn. He showed an early passion for books and study, often took volumes from his father's library, read the Bible, and developed an interest in history and geography. Teachers in the elementary school he entered at the age of 5 noted his strong mind and confidence. Although schools for black children were far worse equipped, with old buildings, worn textbooks, and minimal resources, Martin studied diligently. In one class, he was asked to write an essay about what he wished to become. Many boys wrote about becoming firefighters, doctors, or teachers. Martin wrote that he wished to become a preacher so that, like his father, he could tell people the truth about justice and about God. This essay, preserved in the family archive, became an early sign of the path he would one day choose. The King household discussed not only religion and family matters, but also public issues. Over dinner, his father often spoke about politics, unjust laws, and the idea that black Americans deserved the same rights as white citizens. These conversations left a deep impression. From childhood, Martin watched his parents help neighbors and church members in difficult moments, and all of this shaped in him a sense of responsibility toward others. Despite hardships, the family preserved an atmosphere of warmth and joy. Holidays were celebrated with traditional Southern dishes: fried chicken, sweet potatoes, cornbread, pies, and lemonade. On Sundays, the family attended church services that lasted for hours, yet they never seemed tiring to young Martin. He listened attentively, memorized hymns, and observed how his father led the congregation. These early years became the foundation for everything that came afterward. A childhood shaped by strict faith, love for others, and devotion to justice created the man who would one day step before thousands and say, "I have a dream." It all began here, in Atlanta, on Auburn Avenue, among people who refused to surrender to hardship and who taught their children dignity, faith, and hope. From the moment Martin Luther King Jr. left the walls of his elementary school, his parents and mentors consistently guided his attention toward the idea that education could serve not only as a personal achievement, but also as a tool to serve society. With that understanding, at the age of only 15, he entered Morehouse College, an institution for African Americans whose reputation in the black community of the South was already exceptionally high. His early admission was possible thanks to his ability to master academic material quickly and pass examinations ahead of schedule. Yet even under such circumstances, young Martin initially felt uncertain considering careers in law, medicine, or teaching. At Morehouse, under the influence of its president Benjamin Mays, an outstanding pastor, thinker, and champion of civil rights, Martin began to comprehend more deeply the role the church could play not only in a person's spiritual life, but also in transforming social structures. Mays held frequent discussions with students about justice, moral responsibility, and the ways in which faith could harmonize with public engagement. These conversations gradually strengthened Martin's determination to follow in his father's footsteps and choose the path of a preacher. After graduating from Morehouse in 1948 with a bachelor's degree in sociology, Martin entered Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. The environment there, though still predominantly African American, was more open to interracial communication. King studied theology, ethics, and philosophy, and developed an interest in theologians who emphasized the social responsibilities of Christians. He was particularly influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr and Walter Rauschenbusch, thinkers who argued that Christian faith could not remain detached from the pursuit of justice. Martin excelled academically, receiving top grades and scholarships. He became known not only for discipline, but also for his persuasive ability in discussions, a valuable skill among future pastors. One day, a professor lectured on Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, and King became so absorbed by the subject that he began seeking additional texts, taking notes on the marches, civil disobedience, and the spiritual discipline required to resist violence without responding with violence. One notable episode from his seminary years involved a summer spent in Connecticut working on a tobacco farm alongside other students. For someone raised under strict segregation, life in the North was a revelation. For the first time, he entered a restaurant and was served without refusal. For the first time, he rode a bus without fear of being ordered to move to the back. These seemingly simple experiences became transformative proof that a more just society was possible. After completing Crozer in 1951, King continued his studies at Boston University, entering a doctoral program in systematic theology. There, he began working on his dissertation comparing the ideas of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Weeman. Boston offered an even more intellectually diverse environment. King attended lectures, conversed with professors and students of various races and nationalities, studied Kant, Hegel, Schleiermacher, and continued exploring Gandhi's writings and works on social ethics. During these years, a personal event occurred that changed his life forever. Through mutual acquaintances, he met Coretta Scott, a student at the New England Conservatory of Music, a talented singer with strong principles and a deep interest in political and social justice. At their first date, King arrived in a formal pastor's suit and announced that he sought not merely a wife, but someone with whom he could share his beliefs and his calling. Coretta accepted the challenge, their relationship deepened, and they married in 1953. In 1955, after defending his dissertation and receiving a PhD, King decided to return to the South, understanding that his knowledge and convictions were most urgently needed there. He accepted an invitation to lead Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, a city fraught with racial tension. His sermons quickly became more concrete and urgent, reflecting not only a call to spiritual renewal, but also to civic action, to righteous resistance grounded in Christian faith and the philosophy of nonviolence. He continued to study Gandhi's methods, preparing both himself and his congregation for the trials that were soon to come. Yet only a few months remained before everything changed. For the moment, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote sermons, met with parishioners, discussed the future with Coretta, and, staying faithful to his calling, prepared step by step to become the voice of an entire generation. When in 1954, Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in Montgomery, Alabama to serve as pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, he had no idea that within a single year, his name would be known far beyond the city, far beyond the South itself. He began his ministry with the ordinary duties of a pastor, delivering sermons, meeting with parishioners, organizing gatherings, and reflecting on how to balance pastoral work with civic responsibility in a society still governed by Jim Crow laws. Montgomery in the mid-1950s was a typical southern city where segregation on public transportation was strictly enforced, and bases stood as one of the starkest symbols of racial inequality. African Americans were forced to sit at the back, and if a bus filled up, they were required to surrender their seats to white passengers. This humiliation affected thousands of residents who relied on buses daily, but until a certain moment, protests remained scattered and uncoordinated. Everything changed on the evening of December 1st, 1955. That day, Rosa Parks, a 52-year-old seamstress and longtime NAACP activist, took her seat on a bus. When the driver demanded that she surrender it to a white passenger, she calmly refused. She was arrested, not as an impulsive act by an unprepared person, but as the conscious decision of a woman who had long understood that a stand had to be taken. News of her arrest spread rapidly. Edgar Nixon and other NAACP leaders decided to use the moment to spark a citywide boycott of the bus system. Overnight, leaflets were printed calling on black residents to refuse bus services on Monday, December 5th. Realizing that such a movement needed a leader capable of speaking for the entire community, local activists of the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, gathered and proposed Martin Luther King Jr. Young, educated, respected, and not yet entangled in earlier political rivalries, he became the natural choice. On the evening of December 5th, after the first day of the boycott, when buses truly ran nearly empty, around 5,000 people gathered at Holt Street Church. People stood both inside and outside, listening through open windows. It was there that King delivered his first major public speech as a civil rights leader. He reminded the audience that the boycott was born not from a desire for conflict, but from years of patience that had reached its limit. "We are tired of riding buses standing while empty seats remain beside us, tired of paying for a service and receiving humiliation instead of respect." The words echoed the thoughts of all present. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. Thousands of African Americans walked to work, organized carpools, and created temporary transportation networks. King and MYA colleagues coordinated fleets of volunteer drivers who operated from dawn until late evening. The boycott became a model of organized, disciplined, nonviolent protest. City authorities and bus companies resisted fiercely. On the evening of January 30th, 1956, a bomb exploded on the porch of King's home while Coretta and their daughter Yolanda were inside. By miracle, no one was injured. A large crowd gathered outside, furious and ready to respond, but King urged calm, insisting that the path of nonviolence must remain unbroken even in the face of violence. Meanwhile, lawyers representing the protesters filed a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of bus segregation. The case, Browder versus Gale, resulted in a federal ruling in November 1956 declaring segregation unconstitutional. The Supreme Court upheld the decision in December. Soon afterward, the boycott officially ended. African Americans returned to the buses with full legal equality. On the first day, King himself boarded a bus and rode several stops, a gesture that symbolized a hard-won victory achieved by thousands. The Montgomery bus boycott became not only the first major triumph of the civil rights movement, but also the moment when Martin Luther King Jr.'s name resounded across the nation. He received invitations to speak, write, and participate in conferences, but most importantly, in this period his philosophy of nonviolent resistance became fully formed and would guide him for the rest of his life. Within Montgomery, solidarity flourished. Families shared food, volunteer cars were repaired and fueled collectively, students created leaflets and assisted with organization. This quiet, unseen labor was as vital as the speeches and court cases, and here, in Montgomery, began the story of Martin Luther King as a national leader, a man whose personal courage, faith, and devotion to justice intertwined with the lives of millions who longed for words and actions capable of transforming the world around them. After the end of the Montgomery bus boycott and the final victory in court in the late 1956 year, Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer perceived merely as a local pastor from Alabama, but had become known throughout the country as one of the key leaders of the civil rights movement. Yet the triumph in Montgomery was only the first step on a far longer road, where each new speech, each new march and demonstration became part of a struggle not only to overturn specific unjust laws, but to change the very attitude of society toward racial equality. At the beginning of the year 1957, with his participation, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was founded, an organization whose basic idea was to coordinate the efforts of different churches and activists in the southern states of the United States, uniting pastors and public figures into a single structure capable of organizing large-scale nonviolent campaigns. Martin Luther King Jr. became its first president, and from that moment his days were filled with constant journeys from state to state, meetings with community groups, writing speeches and articles, and publishing texts in newspapers. Among the first tasks of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was the promotion of campaigns for voting rights for African Americans in the South. Although formally, the Constitution of the United States guaranteed every citizen the right to vote, in the southern states local authorities continued to use multiple forms of obstruction, literacy tests, so-called understanding clauses requiring people to interpret sections of the Constitution, poll taxes that many could not afford to pay, and open intimidation. It was in connection with these obstacles that King made numerous trips to Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, and other states, meeting local pastors and activists, helping to organize rallies, and teaching people how to insist on their right to register. In the year 1961, as part of the national struggle for civil rights, the so-called Freedom Rides began, initiated by the Congress of Racial Equality. The aim of these rides was to test the enforcement of earlier Supreme Court decisions that had banned segregation in interstate transport and at bus stations. Activists, both black and white, boarded interstate buses and traveled through southern states, deliberately sitting together and using forbidden waiting rooms and restrooms reserved for whites. These rides were often accompanied by brutal attacks. Buses were pelted with stones, windows were smashed, and the activists themselves faced arrests and beatings. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was not the formal organizer of the rides, but King publicly supported the participants, spoke in their defense, held meetings with journalists and authorities, and drew attention to their fate. One of the largest and most carefully organized campaigns of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was the campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of the year 1963. Birmingham was considered one of the most closed and harshly controlled cities in the South. The Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor was notorious for ordering the use of fire hoses and police dogs at the slightest sign of demonstration. The Birmingham campaign was planned in detail. Protesters organized sit-ins, silent marches, and peaceful actions near shopping districts, demanding an end to segregation in public places and equal rights for African Americans. In April of the year 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested during one of these peaceful protests and placed in solitary confinement. It was there that he wrote his famous Letter from Birmingham Jail. The letter was addressed to local white clergymen who had publicly urged King to renounce precipitate actions and to wait for gradual reforms. In this text, he explained why they could not wait any longer, why peaceful civil disobedience was a moral duty for a person of faith. The phrase from this letter, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," became one of the most frequently quoted expressions in the history of the civil rights movement. The events in Birmingham resonated widely. Photographs of peaceful demonstrators attacked by fire hoses and police dogs were published in the country's leading newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, and broadcast on television. King and his colleagues in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference understood that the struggle in a single city was important, but that to achieve federal legislation, they needed to reach a truly national level. Such a moment came with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, organized in August of the year 1963. Not only the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but also other major organizations took part in preparing the march. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Congress of Racial Equality, the National Urban League, and powerful trade unions. For the first time in the history of the movement, different groups agreed on joint action. The goal of the march was to press for the adoption of a new federal civil rights bill and to draw attention to unemployment among African Americans. On the 28th of August in the year 1963, more than 200,000 people gathered in Washington. People walked with banners and flags, sang spirituals, and stood on the Mall before the Lincoln Memorial. About 30 leaders of the movement spoke in turn with short addresses. Martin Luther King Jr. was scheduled to speak last. At the beginning of his speech, King adhered to the prepared text, but at a certain moment the singer Mahalia Jackson, standing near the platform, called out, "Tell them about the dream." At that point, King put his prepared pages aside and began to speak words that had not been written in advance. "I have a dream." He spoke of the day when on the red hills of Georgia the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners would sit down together at the table of brotherhood, when his 4 children would live in a nation where they would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This speech entered history as one of the greatest speeches of the 20th century. It was broadcast live on radio and television, and its text was printed in newspapers the following day. After the march, King met President John Kennedy and members of Congress to discuss the urgent need for a new Civil Rights Act. Although the law was passed only in the following year, after the March on Washington it became clear that the civil rights movement had moved beyond the framework of the southern states and become a cause for the entire nation. The March on Washington marked both the culmination of one stage and the beginning of another. After it, Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer seen only as a leader of Southern Baptist congregations or as an organizer from Alabama and Georgia. He became a figure of national stature, a man whose words were listened to in universities, churches, and government offices. Yet with this new status came growing pressure, an increasing number of opponents, and ever more difficult choices, circumstances that would become clear in the next episodes of his life. It was precisely in this space, between speeches and marches, letters and arrests, that in the heart of Martin Luther King Jr., the image of the leader was finally formed, the image that would remain in history not merely as a defender of the rights of his own people, but as a person who spoke on behalf of all those who yearned for justice and equality. After Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice rang out before hundreds of thousands of people at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington in August of the year 1963, and his words about a dream became known across the country, a period began in which the struggle for civil rights reached the highest levels of national politics, while at the same time, a burden settled upon King's shoulders that grew heavier with each passing month, a burden of constant attacks, contradictions, personal doubts, and pressure from all sides. By the autumn of that same year, he continued traveling from state to state, speaking, meeting community groups, and taking part in negotiations with federal officials. President John Kennedy, who had supported the March on Washington, discussed next steps with King in person. But on the 22nd of November in Dallas, Kennedy was assassinated, a blow not only to the country, but to the movement as a whole. Lyndon Johnson, who became president, preserved the reform course, yet the atmosphere in the United States grew more tense, and the struggle took on new outlines. Against this background, not only King's visibility increased, but also criticism directed at him. One of the main lines of disagreement was that within the movement more radical groups were emerging, above all in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality. Young leaders accused King of excessive moderation, argued that the strategy of peaceful protest was insufficiently effective, and claimed that it was impossible to reach real agreement with the authorities. King, however, continued to insist on nonviolent resistance, believing that only such a path could produce long-term results. At the same time, a covert campaign against King began from federal agencies. Already in the year 1963, the Federal Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover started wiretapping his phones and monitoring his activities as part of the COINTELPRO program. The conflict became especially sharp in the year 1964, when King received the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent work in defense of human rights. This recognition drew the attention of the entire world, but it also spurred the FBI to intensify its attempts to discredit him. In the autumn of the year 1964, King received an anonymous letter in which he was threatened and urged to take his own life, with insinuations about his private life and audio recordings attached that had been made in hotel rooms. Later, it became known that the letter had come from the FBI. This letter and the entire campaign became a serious psychological test for King. According to the recollections of his closest associates, during this period he became more withdrawn, spent evenings alone in his study, prayed, and reread passages from the Bible, especially from the Psalms and the letters of the Apostle Paul. At the same time, he continued to work almost without rest. One of the key campaigns of that period was the struggle for African American rights in St. Augustine, Florida, in the summer of the year 1964. St. Augustine, one of the oldest cities in the United States, preserved extremely rigid segregation. King personally took part in actions against segregation in restaurants and hotels. He was arrested during one of the peaceful protests when, together with other activists, he attempted to enter a whites-only restaurant. In jail, he once again spoke to his companions about the need to maintain disciplined nonviolence, even when it was particularly difficult. During this same period, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference continued its campaign for the adoption of a federal Civil Rights Act. In July of the year 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed this act, a milestone in the country's history, which banned racial discrimination in public places and in employment and education. Yet King understood that the law by itself did not fundamentally change conditions on the ground, especially in the South, where local authorities continued to seek ways around the new rules. Within the movement, disagreements about further strategy intensified. Some insisted that the focus should shift toward economic rights, the fight against poverty, and a broader concept of social justice. Others argued for stronger pressure through mass protests, marches, and strikes. King increasingly found himself in the center of these discussions, striving to preserve unity while realizing that such unity was becoming harder to maintain. By the mid-1964 to 1965 years, King's personal exhaustion became obvious to everyone close to him. According to the recollections of his wife, Coretta Scott King, and his most trusted aides, he slept only a few hours each night, often spoke of feeling drained, yet continued working. In one interview from that period, he said, "Sometimes it seems to me that I live in several worlds at once. One is the world of speeches and meetings, another is the world of prayer, and a third is the world of silence, when I'm alone and ask myself questions that no one else can answer." These words reflected the real condition of a leader who felt the pressure of the authorities, his own associates, and his inner doubts all at once. One of the most memorable scenes from that time took place in Atlanta in the autumn of the year 1964, when King returned home from another trip. Witnesses recalled that he stood by the window for a long time, looking out at the street, holding a Bible in his hand without opening it, and only after several minutes sat at the table and began writing notes for his next speech. The situation was further complicated by the changing stance of the mass media. Whereas earlier the press had covered events such as the March on Washington in a positive tone, now newspapers increasingly used phrases like national disorder and insufficient moderation of movement leaders. King saw danger in this shift, yet he did not renounce public statements, continuing to insist that without truth and open conversation the country would not be able to move forward. By the beginning of the year 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. found himself at the boundary between two stages of his life. On one side lay a history of significant victories: Montgomery, Birmingham, Washington, and the Civil Rights Act. On the other side awaited new challenges, above all the fight for voting rights and for economic justice, which would become the theme of the next campaigns. After the adoption in the summer of the year 1964 of the Civil Rights Act, which banned racial discrimination in public places and in employment, Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference understood that this was merely one milestone on the road to genuine equality, not the end of the struggle. One of the most crucial unresolved problems remained the right to vote. Despite legal guarantees, in southern states, especially in Alabama and Mississippi, local authorities systematically prevented African Americans from registering through so-called literacy tests, poll taxes, and direct intimidation. The city of Selma in Alabama became, in the beginning of the year 1965, the epicenter of the struggle for voting rights. According to the figures of the time, out of more than 15,000 African Americans in Selma, only a few hundred were registered voters, and the local registrar Jim Clark was notorious for his harsh methods, including arrests and the use of force against those who tried to submit registration applications. King and the leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference launched a campaign in Selma in January of the year 1965, joining forces with local activists from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. From the first weeks, the actions took on an organized form. Every day, groups of demonstrators walked peacefully to the courthouse to attempt to register, and almost every day the police detained them. In one such episode, on the 1st of February in the year 1965, local activist Amelia Boynton Robinson was arrested and brutally mistreated, which caused a wave of indignation throughout the country. Martin Luther King Jr. himself was arrested in Selma on the 1st of February and spent a night in jail. His notes from this period show that he saw what was happening as a continuation of the Birmingham campaign, yet he also realized that the struggle for the vote had an even deeper meaning, because without participation in elections, African Americans had no way to influence the making of laws. The culmination of the Selma campaign was the march from Selma to Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, a journey of about 54 miles, or roughly 87 kilometers. The first march took place on the 7th of March in the year 1965 and entered history as Bloody Sunday. Around 600 participants set out, but upon reaching the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met with a brutal attack by state troopers and local law enforcement. Batons, tear gas, and mounted units were used. Footage of the attack was broadcast on national television, provoking outrage across the United States. King was not present at the first march, as he was in Atlanta at the time, but he immediately returned to Selma to organize a second demonstration on the 9th of March, known as Turnaround Tuesday. This time, the column again reached the bridge, yet, fearing further bloodshed and without a clear federal court order, King stopped, prayed with the marchers, and then led them back. This decision caused debates and criticism among activists, but King explained that he had to protect the lives of those who followed him. After several days of negotiation, the march received official sanction. The third and final march began on the 21st of March and ended on the 25th of March in the year 1965. Thousands of people walked the route under federal protection, and on the last day more than 25,000 participants gathered on the outskirts of Montgomery. At the state capitol, King gave a speech that entered history, declaring that the road had been long, but they had come because truth and justice ultimately prevail. In August of the year 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which prohibited any restrictions on participation in elections, including literacy tests and poll taxes. For King, this was not only a political victory, but also a moral confirmation that the strategy of nonviolent resistance continued to bear fruit. Still, he understood that beyond the South, systemic injustice persisted, especially in the North, where no formal segregation laws existed, but racial barriers remained in education, healthcare, employment, and especially in housing policy. At the beginning of the year 1966, the Chicago campaign of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began, the first large-scale project of King outside the southern states. Together with his family, he moved into a poor neighborhood of North Lawndale on the west side of Chicago. This step was a deliberate gesture, demonstrating that the leader of the movement was prepared to share the daily hardships of those he defended. In Chicago, activists from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and local organizations fought to improve housing conditions and end discrimination in renting apartments. Rents for black families were often higher than for white tenants, while buildings were in worse condition, with no repairs, and sometimes without basic amenities. One of the most famous episodes of the Chicago campaign was the march on the 5th of August in the year 1966 to the Marquette Park area. As the protesters moved along the street, they encountered a hostile crowd. A stone thrown from the crowd struck King in the head. Later, he admitted to journalists that although he had been arrested and threatened in the South, he had never seen hatred as intense as what he encountered in Chicago. Despite this, King did not halt the campaign. As a result of negotiations with Mayor Richard Daley and local real estate interests, an agreement was signed in August of the year 1966, under which landlords pledged voluntarily to abandon discriminatory rental practices. Even so, King himself acknowledged that enforcing these agreements was extremely difficult. Unlike the southern states, where the struggle was clearly directed against explicit discriminatory laws, in Chicago the movement confronted more subtle forms of racism that were not directly inscribed in legislation. By the middle of the year 1967, King increasingly spoke of the need to focus not only on racial issues but also on social justice in a broader sense: poverty, unemployment, and inequality in access to education and healthcare. It was then that he began openly opposing the war in Vietnam, convinced that military spending deprived the country of resources needed to solve domestic social problems. Yet these developments already led into the events described in the next chapter. Between Selma and Chicago, the image of King was ultimately formed as a combination of pastor, human rights advocate, and public thinker. A man who sought to transform American society not only within the framework of the civil rights struggle, but also in the understanding that true justice must concern every person, regardless of skin color, income, or place of residence. By the end of the year 1967, after years filled with marches, rallies, and legislative victories, Martin Luther King Jr. clearly understood that the civil rights movement was entering a new phase, in which the central issue was no longer only legal equality, but also real economic justice for millions of poor Americans, both African Americans and whites. It was at this time that he, together with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, began preparing a campaign that would be called the Poor People's Campaign. Its goal was to organize a massive, peaceful demonstration in Washington where participants would set up a tent encampment and demand that Congress adopt a new federal program to combat poverty and social injustice. King hoped to unite in this campaign people from very different backgrounds: workers from the southern states, unemployed residents of the North, farmers from the Appalachian region, and representatives of Latino and indigenous communities. In December of the year 1967, he officially announced the beginning of preparations, but already at the start of the following year, it became clear that the organization's attention would be urgently needed elsewhere. On the 12th of February in the year 1968, a strike of municipal sanitation workers began in Memphis, Tennessee, almost all of whom were African American. The immediate trigger was the death of two workers, Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, who, during a heavy rain, took shelter in the back of a garbage truck and were crushed there because of a malfunctioning compactor mechanism. City authorities refused to pay compensation to their families and ignored the workers' demands for higher wages, better working conditions, and recognition of their union. When King learned about the strike, he immediately saw in it not just a local labor dispute, but a symbol of everything he had been speaking about in recent years: the rights of workers, the poor, and the humiliated. He arrived in Memphis in March of the year 1968 to support the strikers. The first large march, organized on the 28th of March, began peacefully, but ended in chaos when a group of younger, more radical participants moved into the column, shop windows were smashed, and the police used force. During the dispersal, a 15-year-old teenager, Larry Payne, was shot and killed by a police officer. These events deeply shook King. In conversations with his closest associates, he admitted that what troubled him most was the loss of the nonviolent character of the protest, and it was precisely for that reason that he made the decision to return to Memphis to personally lead a new, strictly peaceful march and to restore discipline within the movement. By that time, King had already said more than once that he felt tired, but he refused to slow the pace of his work. His aides recalled how in March and early April he looked weary, spoke less than usual, yet continued writing speeches and taking part in endless meetings. In Memphis, King stayed at the Lorraine Motel in room 306, which became his temporary headquarters. The days were spent in negotiations with union leaders, city officials, and activists, and in the evenings he sat with his closest colleagues, discussing the details of the upcoming march. According to the recollections of Andrew Young and Ralph Abernathy, during those days he often read passages from the Bible, especially from the book of Exodus and the letters of the Apostle Paul, finding in them words of support for himself and for those around him. On the 3rd of April in the year 1968, an evening meeting was held at the Church of God in Christ headquarters, where King delivered the speech that later became known as "I Have Been to the Mountaintop." In that speech, which proved to be his last, he spoke about the fate of the movement, about faith and fear, and about the fact that he personally was no longer so important, because what mattered most was that the path should continue. "I have been to the mountaintop, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." Witnesses later recalled that after this speech, an unusual silence hung over the hall. On the following day, the 4th of April in the year 1968, in the evening, King and his friends were preparing to leave the motel for dinner at the home of a local pastor. At about 6 minutes past 6 in the evening, as he stood on the balcony outside room 306 talking with musician Ben Branch and his aide Jesse Jackson, a shot rang out from the window of a nearby building. The bullet struck King in the neck, passing through his jaw and spine. He was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital in Memphis, but at about 5 minutes past 7 in the evening, his death was officially announced. News of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. swept across the United States within hours. In dozens of cities, spontaneous rallies and mass demonstrations began, some of which grew into riots. President Lyndon Johnson addressed the nation, calling for peace and urging Americans to honor the memory of the slain leader. King's funeral took place on the 9th of April in Atlanta. Thousands of people came to the funeral procession, and the coffin was carried on a simple wooden cart drawn by 2 mules, a symbol of the very simplicity and closeness to the people that had always accompanied his struggle. Thus, the earthly life of Martin Luther King Jr. came to an end. But the words he had spoken the previous evening in Memphis became not only a summation of his path, but also a parting message to all who continued the struggle for justice. From that moment on, he entered history irrevocably as a man who, until the final hour, remained faithful to his dream of peace, equality, and human dignity for everyone. After Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in Memphis on the 4th of April in the year 1968, his life was over, but the cause to which he had devoted himself did not stop. Already in the first weeks after his death, it became clear that America had changed not only because of the laws adopted during the Civil Rights Movement, but also because millions of people had, for the first time, become fully aware of the value of nonviolent protest and of the power of words capable of reshaping society. One of the first steps after King's assassination was the signing by President Lyndon Johnson of the Fair Housing Act on the 11th of April in the year 1968. This law, long debated and blocked in Congress, was passed in many ways under the influence of public reaction to King's death. It prohibited racial discrimination in the sale and rental of housing and became the last of the major civil rights laws of the 1960s. Even more important, however, than this political result was the cultural memory of Martin Luther King. Already at the end of the 1960s, initiatives began to appear calling for a national holiday in his honor. The campaign for such a day lasted for almost 15 years and concluded in the year 1983, when President Ronald Reagan signed a law establishing Martin Luther King Day as a federal holiday. It was first officially observed in January of the year 1986. In the following years, the holiday was introduced in all 50 states, becoming a day not only of remembrance but also of voluntary service. In many cities across the country, educational events, charitable actions, and public readings of his speeches are held on that day. King's physical legacy has been preserved in memorials and place names. In the year 2011, in Washington District of Columbia, the Martin Luther King Jr. National Memorial was dedicated, the first monument on the National Mall dedicated to an African American and a civil rights leader. The memorial consists of a large granite stone from which King's figure appears to emerge, gazing into the distance. On the surrounding walls, quotations from his speeches are inscribed, not only from the famous "I Have a Dream" address, but also from later speeches in which he spoke about social justice, economic equality, and peace throughout the world. Yet the most important legacy remains living and intangible: his ideas and words, which continue to sound in new circumstances. In the 21st century, when new waves of protest against racial inequality and police violence arise in the United States, King's name is heard again and again in the speeches of activists, politicians, and public figures. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance, rooted in Christian principles and the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, continues to serve as a foundation for peaceful protest movements not only in America, but in many other countries. His image is present in thousands of schools, universities, churches, libraries, and museums. In United States educational programs, the study of the civil rights movement remains a mandatory element, and King's name occupies a central place. His biography, letters, and speeches are studied not only as historical material, but also as a source of moral and ethical reflection on what it means to be a citizen, what it means to serve society, and what it means to struggle for justice. In recent years, King's image has also become the subject of deeper and more complex analysis. Historians and commentators remind us that he was not only the author of inspiring speeches, but also a man who, in the last years of his life, spoke about poverty, economic inequality, and the war in Vietnam. He was criticized for going beyond civil rights, yet it was precisely this broadening of his concerns that made him a figure relevant beyond the specific historical circumstances of the 1960s. Today, when the streets of American cities are once more filled with marches, placards, and chants, when debates about social policy and race relations intensify, the name of Martin Luther King Jr. remains a symbol of the belief that peaceful words and firm conviction can change even the most rigid social orders. His dream did not die with him. It continues to live in laws, in collective memory, and in the lives of people who, like him, believe in peace, equality, and dignity for every person, regardless of skin color, origin, or income. And in this lies the most important legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., not in statues and not in calendar dates, but in the fact that millions continue to walk along the road he once pointed out to the world.